Have you ever wondered what happens when power goes unchecked? What starts as a dream can quickly turn into a nightmare when greed takes over. This is the story of Mary Williams, a founder who risked everything to expose the dark secrets hiding within her own company. Disguised as a janitor, she uncovered lies, corruption, and betrayal at every level. But this isn't just her fight, it's a lesson for all of us about courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right. If you're ready to hear a story that will shock, inspire, and stay with you long after it's over, hit that subscribe button and join us on this unforgettable journey. Let me tell you about Mary Williams. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room just by walking into it. A trailblazer in every sense of the word, she founded Williams Innovations, a fintech company that revolutionized how people managed their money. Back in the early 2000s, when most folks were still figuring out how to use online banking, Mary had already envisioned an app that would let users track expenses, save for retirement, and invest, all from one sleek platform. It wasn't easy. There were sleepless nights, countless rejections from venture capitalists, and moments where even her closest friends thought she'd lost her mind. But Mary didn't care. She believed in her vision, and eventually, so did everyone else. By the time she retired at 65, Williams Innovations was worth billions, with offices across 3 continents. But retirement didn't come naturally to someone like Mary. For years, she poured her heart and soul into building this company, treating it almost like another child. So handing over the reins to her son, Robert, felt bittersweet. At first glance, Robert seemed like the perfect successor. He was smart, ambitious, and well-liked, at least on paper. Growing up, he'd always been good with numbers, earning top grades in business school and interning at some of Silicon Valley's biggest names. When Mary announced his promotion to CEO during the annual shareholder meeting, the applause was thunderous. Everyone believed in him, or so they said. For the first few months after stepping down, Mary stayed busy traveling, gardening, and indulging in hobbies she hadn't touched in decades. Yet, no matter how far away she tried to get from the corporate world, whispers kept finding their way back to her. Strange rumors began circulating among former colleagues and industry insiders. Some mentioned a toxic work environment under Robert's leadership. Others talked about employees being mistreated or forced out because they dared to question decisions. At first, Mary dismissed these stories as idle gossip. After all, running a global company wasn't easy, and change often came with growing pains. But then, something happened that made her sit up and take notice. One afternoon, while sipping coffee at her favorite cafe, Mary ran into Sarah Chen, a senior analyst who'd been with Williams Innovations since its early days. Sarah had always struck Mary as level-headed and loyal, someone who wouldn't spread baseless rumors. As they caught up, Sarah hesitated before finally blurting out what had been weighing on her mind. "Mary," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, "things aren't the same anymore. I don't recognize the company we built together." Sarah went on to describe alarming incidents of discrimination within the workplace. Women and minorities, once celebrated for their contributions, now found themselves sidelined or passed over for promotions. One particularly troubling story involved a talented young engineer named Jamal Washington, whose innovative ideas had earned him recognition in tech circles. According to Sarah, Jamal had been abruptly demoted after challenging Robert's decision to cut funding for a promising project. When Jamal protested, he was accused of insubordination and eventually fired without severance. The more Sarah spoke, the heavier Mary's heart grew. These weren't isolated incidents either. There were whispers of favoritism, nepotism, and outright abuse of power. Senior executives reportedly received lavish bonuses despite poor performance, while lower-level employees struggled to make ends meet. Financial misconduct accusations also surfaced, though details remained vague. Was Robert mismanaging funds? Or worse, was he embezzling? Mary couldn't believe her own son would stoop so low. And yet, the evidence piling up against him was hard to ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, Mary decided to act, not as the wealthy founder of Williams Innovations but as an ordinary employee. Disguising herself as Janet Davis, a middle-aged janitor looking for part-time work, she applied for a position at the company's headquarters. With her silver-streaked hair tucked under a cap and glasses perched on her nose, Mary blended seamlessly into the background. No one suspected that the quiet, unassuming woman mopping floors late at night was actually the person who'd built the empire towering above them. Her first week on the job was eye-opening, to say the least. Working the graveyard shift meant Mary had access to areas of the building usually off-limits during regular hours. She cleaned executive offices, conference rooms, and break areas, listening carefully to conversations left behind on voicemails or scribbled on sticky notes. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. In one corner office, she overheard two managers discussing how to handle a whistleblower, an employee who'd recently filed a complaint about sexual harassment. Their tone was casual, almost flippant, as if silencing dissenters was just another item on their to-do list. In another room, Mary stumbled upon discarded documents detailing suspicious financial transactions. Large sums of money appeared to be funneled through shell companies, raising red flags about potential fraud. Each new piece of information only deepened her unease. Yet, the most heartbreaking moments came when Mary interacted directly with other employees. Late-night janitors and security guards confided in her, sharing stories of burnout, fear, and disillusionment. Many felt trapped, unable to leave because of financial obligations or too afraid to speak up lest they lose their jobs altogether. Listening to their struggles reminded Mary of why she started Williams Innovations in the first place, to create opportunities, not destroy lives. As weeks turned into months, Mary continued gathering evidence, piecing together a disturbing picture of what her company had become. She learned that Robert's leadership style was authoritarian, bordering on tyrannical. Employees lived in constant fear of making mistakes, knowing full well that any slip-up could cost them dearly. Performance reviews, once fair and transparent, had devolved into subjective assessments based on personal biases. Those who aligned themselves with Robert thrived, those who didn't faced retaliation. One evening, while cleaning the boardroom, Mary overheard a heated argument between Robert and his CFO, Daniel Carter. From what she could gather, Daniel had uncovered discrepancies in the quarterly earnings report and confronted Robert about them. "You can't keep cooking the books forever," Daniel warned. "Sooner or later, someone's going to find out." Robert's response was chilling. "And if they do," he snapped, "by then, I'll be long gone, and you'll be holding the bag." Mary's blood ran cold. Her son wasn't just reckless, he was dangerous. If these allegations were true, he was putting not only the company but also thousands of employees and shareholders at risk. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. How could she have missed the signs? Had she been too focused on success to see the cracks forming beneath the surface? Despite the mounting evidence, Mary knew she couldn't confront Robert head-on, not yet. She needed irrefutable proof, something concrete enough to expose the corruption festering within Williams Innovations. So she doubled down on her efforts, sneaking into restricted areas and copying sensitive files whenever possible. Every stolen document, every whispered conversation, brought her closer to the truth. But playing the role of Janet Davis took its toll. The physical labor was exhausting, and the emotional burden weighed heavily on her conscience. Nights spent alone in her tiny apartment, poring over spreadsheets and memos, left her feeling drained and isolated. Still, she refused to give up. This wasn't just about protecting her legacy, it was about doing the right thing. One fateful night, Mary struck gold. While cleaning the IT department, she discovered a hidden server containing encrypted files. Using skills she hadn't tapped into since her coding days, she managed to decrypt the data, revealing a trove of incriminating evidence. Emails, bank statements, internal memos, it was all there, painting a damning portrait of Robert's misconduct. Armed with this information, Mary realized she had two choices: expose her son and risk destroying everything they'd worked for, or stay silent and allow the rot to spread unchecked. Neither option appealed to her, but deep down, she knew what she had to do. The company might survive the scandal, but it wouldn't survive her silence. With trembling hands, Mary copied the files onto a USB drive and slipped it into her pocket. Tomorrow, she would step out of the shadows and reclaim her place as the leader Williams' innovations desperately needed. For better or worse, the battle for her company's soul was about to begin. Mary Williams stood outside the towering glass doors of Williams Innovations, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. Dressed in worn jeans, an oversized hoodie, and sneakers that looked like they'd seen better days, she barely resembled the confident businesswoman who once strode through these halls. Today, she was Janet Davis, a middle-aged janitor just trying to make ends meet. She clutched her application form tightly, rehearsing the story she'd crafted about needing flexible hours to care for her aging mother. The hiring process was surprisingly smooth. No one questioned her references or background too closely. After all, who would expect the founder of the company to apply for such a lowly position? Within 2 days, Mary received a call offering her the job. It felt surreal, almost poetic, that she'd have to clean the very floors she once walked on as CEO. But this wasn't about pride, it was about uncovering the truth. On her first day, Mary arrived early, eager to blend into the shadows. The head custodian, Mr. Parker, greeted her warmly and introduced her to the rest of the team. There was Carlos Ramirez, a hard-working single father whose wife had passed away unexpectedly, leaving him to raise their 8-year-old daughter alone. Then there was Angela Thompson, a soft-spoken woman juggling 3 jobs to support her children while her husband served time in prison. Both were kind, welcoming, and shared stories of resilience that made Mary's chest ache with admiration and guilt. How had she not noticed people like them before? As the group dispersed to begin their shifts, Gerald Hayes, the operations manager, stormed into the break room. Tall, broad-shouldered, and perpetually scowling, he carried himself with an air of superiority that instantly grated on Mary. "Listen up," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. "I don't care how long you've been here or what your sob stories are. This building needs to shine, and if it doesn't, you'll hear from me." His eyes landed on Mary last, lingering just long enough to make her feel small. "Especially you, new girl. Don't screw this up." Over the next few weeks, Mary quickly learned that Gerald wasn't just tough, he was cruel. He treated the janitors like second-class citizens, barking orders and belittling them at every turn. One evening, when Angela accidentally spilled cleaning solution near the elevators, Gerald didn't hesitate to humiliate her in front of everyone. "What are you even doing here?" he sneered, his face inches from hers. "You're useless. Maybe you should go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Angela bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes, but said nothing. Later, in the safety of the supply closet, she confided in Mary. "He does this all the time," she whispered. "We can't fight back. If we complain, we lose our jobs." But Gerald wasn't the only problem. As Mary navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the company late at night, she encountered Derek Phillips, the marketing director. With his tailored suits, slicked back hair, and condescending smirk, Derek embodied everything wrong with corporate culture. On more than one occasion, Mary overheard him speaking down to lower-level employees, dismissing their ideas without a second thought. Honestly, he told his assistant during one heated exchange, "If you can't keep up, maybe this isn't the place for you." The poor woman stammered an apology, visibly shaken. Despite the toxicity swirling around her, Mary found solace in Chris Taylor, a young intern working in the IT department. Unlike the others, Chris seemed genuinely kind and empathetic. Late one night, as Mary mopped the floor outside his cubicle, he struck up a conversation. "Hey, Janet, right?" he asked, offering a warm smile. "Thanks for keeping things clean around here. We couldn't do our jobs without you." Simple words, yet they meant the world to Mary. Over time, she learned that Chris came from a modest background, paying his way through college by working odd jobs. He dreamed of climbing the corporate ladder but refused to compromise his values along the way. Chris became something of an ally, often sharing tidbits of information he overheard during meetings. "Things aren't great upstairs," he admitted one evening, lowering his voice. "There's talk of layoffs, budget cuts, and, well, some shady stuff I probably shouldn't mention." Though vague, his comments reinforced Mary's suspicions. Something rotten was festering within Williams' innovations, and she intended to root it out. As Mary settled deeper into her role, she began noticing patterns, subtle but undeniable signs of dysfunction. For instance, Gerald frequently assigned the most grueling tasks to Angela and Carlos, ensuring they worked longer hours for the same pay. When Mary confronted him about it, pretending to be naive, Gerald simply shrugged. "They need the money," he said dismissively. "Besides, someone has to pick up the slack." Meanwhile, Derek continued flaunting his arrogance, treating non-executive staff like invisible servants. One night, Mary watched as he snapped at a receptionist for bringing him the wrong coffee order. "How hard is it to remember I take almond milk?" he spat, tossing the cup into the trash. The receptionist apologized profusely, her hands trembling as she scurried away. Mary clenched her fists, resisting the urge to step in and defend her. Yet, amidst the chaos, moments of humanity shone through. Carlos often brought homemade tamales to share with the team, insisting they needed fuel to get through their shifts. Angela taught Mary tricks for removing stubborn stains, laughing softly as they bonded over their shared struggles. Even Chris, despite his demanding workload, always found time to chat, offering encouragement and advice. These connections reminded Mary why she cared so deeply about this company, not because of its profits or prestige, but because of the people who kept it running. Still, the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on everyone. Conversations grew quieter, smiles rarer. Employees tiptoed around executives, afraid to draw attention to themselves. Mary saw firsthand how fear stifled creativity and collaboration, turning what was once a vibrant workplace into a sterile, soulless machine. And she knew Robert was at the center of it all. One particularly grueling night, Mary decided to push her luck. While cleaning the executive wing, she lingered outside Robert's office, straining to catch snippets of conversation. Inside, voices rose and fell, discussing strategies for the upcoming quarter. "We need to cut costs," Robert declared, his tone firm. "Start with the janitorial staff. They're expendable." Mary froze, her mop hovering mid-air. Expendable. The word hit her like a punch to the gut. Later that week, Gerald announced plans to reduce the janitorial team by half, citing budget constraints. Unsurprisingly, Angela and Carlos topped the list of those slated for termination. Outraged, Mary considered confronting Gerald directly, but Chris stopped her. "You can't," he warned. "If you cause trouble, they'll trace it back to you. Trust me, I've seen it happen before." Instead, Mary devised a plan. Using her access to restricted areas, she began documenting evidence of mismanagement and misconduct. She photographed overflowing trash bins left untouched due to understaffing, recorded complaints from disgruntled employees, and even managed to snag a copy of the proposed budget cuts. Each piece of evidence strengthened her case against Robert, but also put her at greater risk. Her growing involvement didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as she sorted through files in the IT server room, Chris appeared, concern etched across his face. "Janet," he said urgently, "you're playing with fire. If anyone finds out what you're doing," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mary met his gaze, unwavering. "I know," she replied softly. "But sometimes, you have to burn the house down to rebuild it." The closer Mary got to exposing the truth, the more dangerous her situation became. Gerald grew suspicious of her late-night wanderings, often appearing unannounced to check on her progress. One night, as she slipped a folder of incriminating documents into her bag, he cornered her in the hallway. "What exactly are you looking for, Janet?" he demanded, his voice dripping with menace. Mary forced a laugh, feigning innocence. "Just making sure I didn't miss any spots," she replied, holding up her mop. Gerald narrowed his eyes but said nothing, allowing her to leave, for now. Back home, Mary pored over the evidence, piecing together a narrative that would implicate not only Robert but also those complicit in his schemes. Emails revealed secret meetings between executives, detailing plans to manipulate quarterly earnings reports. Bank statements showed funds being siphoned into offshore accounts. Employee testimonials painted a damning picture of systemic abuse and neglect. Together, they formed an irrefutable indictment of Williams Innovations' leadership. But as the pieces fell into place, Mary faced a moral dilemma. Exposing Robert would destroy him, and possibly the company. Yet staying silent meant condoning the very behavior she despised. Torn between loyalty and justice, she turned to Chris for guidance. "Do you think people can change?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Chris hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe. But only if they're held accountable." With renewed resolve, Mary prepared to take the final step. She drafted an anonymous email to the board of directors, attaching copies of the evidence she'd gathered. Before hitting send, she paused, staring at the screen. This was it, the moment of no return. Taking a deep breath, she clicked the button and leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. And whether Williams' innovation survived or crumbled, one thing was certain: Mary Williams had done everything in her power to set it right. Mary's days as Janet Davis were becoming increasingly difficult, not just physically but emotionally. Each shift brought new indignities, reminders of how far the company had fallen under Robert's leadership. One evening, while cleaning the executive lounge, she witnessed a scene that made her blood boil. Gerald Hayes, ever the tyrant, strode into the room with his usual swagger. He carried a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. Without warning, he accidentally spilled the entire contents of the cup onto the pristine marble floor. "Hey, janitor," he barked, snapping his fingers at Mary. "What are you waiting for? Clean this up right now." His tone was sharp, dripping with disdain, as if her sole purpose in life was to cater to his whims. For a moment, Mary hesitated, her grip tightening on the mop handle. She wanted nothing more than to tell him exactly who she was and demand an apology, not just for herself but for every employee he'd mistreated. But she swallowed her anger, forcing a neutral expression. "Yes, sir," she muttered, bending down to clean the mess. As she worked, Gerald loomed over her, arms crossed, watching with a smug grin. "You know," he said loudly enough for others nearby to hear, "we should really reconsider hiring people like her. No work ethic, no initiative. Maybe we need to outsource this job altogether." The comment stung, not because it was directed at her personally, but because she knew how hard Angela, Carlos, and the rest of the team worked. They weren't lazy or incompetent, they were survivors, doing their best in impossible circumstances. Yet, Gerald treated them like disposable cogs in a machine. When he finally left, Mary stood up slowly, her back aching from bending over. She glanced around the empty lounge, taking stock of the opulence surrounding her: plush leather chairs, crystal chandeliers, imported marble countertops. It was a stark contrast to the dingy break room where the janitors ate lunch, crammed between overflowing trash bins and flickering fluorescent lights. The disparity infuriated her. These executives lived in luxury while those who kept the building running struggled to survive. It wasn't fair, and Mary was determined to expose the truth. Later that night, Mary found herself outside the boardroom, mopping quietly as executives filtered in for a late-night meeting. Normally, she would have avoided lingering too long near such gatherings, but something about tonight felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, almost electric. Voices carried through the partially open door, snippets of conversation revealing cracks in the polished facade of Williams Innovations. Inside, Derek Phillips, the arrogant marketing director, was holding court, his voice dripping with condescension. Honestly, he sneered, why do we even bother pretending these lower-level employees matter? They're replaceable. If one leaves, another will come along begging for scraps. Laughter erupted from the group, though it sounded forced, hollow. Mary clenched her fists, resisting the urge to storm in and confront them. But then came a more chilling revelation. Chris Taylor, the intern who had become her ally, mentioned during a chat earlier that week that some executives were manipulating company finances for personal gain. Now, listening intently, Mary realized he hadn't exaggerated. Through the crack in the door, she heard Robert himself discussing offshore accounts and shell companies. It's simple, he explained calmly, as if talking about the weather. We funnel excess profits into these accounts, claim losses on paper, and pocket the difference. No one's looking closely enough to notice. Mary's stomach churned. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was outright theft. And worst of all, no one seemed to care. The executives nodded approvingly, congratulating each other on their cleverness. To them, it was a game, a way to line their pockets while everyone else suffered. Mary felt sickened by their callousness, their blatant disregard for ethics and accountability. She couldn't let this continue. Determined to gather more evidence, Mary began pushing boundaries, testing how far she could go without raising suspicion. During her shifts, she lingered longer in restricted areas, pretending to scrub floors or dust shelves while secretly observing interactions. One evening, she overheard Gerald bragging to Derek about cutting corners in safety protocols to save money. Who cares if the fire alarms are outdated, he scoffed. It's not like anyone's going to die here. Besides, replacing them costs a fortune. The casual cruelty of his words hit Mary like a punch to the gut. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were human lives being put at risk for profit. She jotted down notes in her phone, careful to disguise them as grocery lists or reminders. Every detail mattered, every careless remark, every unethical decision. Together, they formed a damning portrait of corruption that reached the highest levels of the company. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed, however. One night, as she lingered near the IT server room, Chris approached her, concern etched across his face. Janet, he whispered urgently, you're playing a dangerous game. People are starting to talk. Gerald thinks you're snooping around too much. Mary forced a smile, trying to appear calm. I'm just doing my job, she replied lightly. But inside, her heart raced. She knew Chris was right. The longer she stayed undercover, the greater the risk of exposure. Despite the danger, Mary refused to back down. That same night, she discovered a hidden filing cabinet in the supply closet, its contents detailing years of financial misconduct. Payroll discrepancies, inflated expense reports, forged contracts, it was all there, meticulously documented. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. This was bigger than she'd imagined, a web of lies that stretched across departments and continents. And at the center of it all was Robert. As Mary delved deeper into the corruption, she began to see parallels between the company's decline and her own failures as a leader. Had she been so focused on growth and innovation that she ignored the people keeping the business afloat? Had she created a culture where greed and exploitation could flourish unchecked? The questions haunted her, gnawing at her conscience. One particularly grueling night, Angela confided in her about the impending layoffs. They're cutting us loose next week, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. How am I supposed to feed my kids without this job? Mary listened silently, her chest tightening with guilt. She wanted to tell Angela everything, that she was fighting to fix this, that help was coming, but she couldn't risk blowing her cover. Instead, she offered what little comfort she could, promising to stand by her friend no matter what. Meanwhile, Gerald's hostility toward Mary escalated. He assigned her increasingly demeaning tasks, forcing her to clean bathrooms multiple times a day or scrub gum off the underside of desks. When she complained, even mildly, he retaliated by docking her hours. "You want to play games?" he growled one evening, cornering her in the hallway. "Fine. Let's see how long you last without a paycheck." Mary met his glare unflinchingly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Mary remained resolute. She knew she was close to uncovering the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that would bring the entire house of cards crashing down. All she needed was a little more time. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While cleaning the executive lounge late one night, Mary stumbled upon a forgotten laptop belonging to Derek Phillips. Its screen was still lit, displaying an open email thread between him and several other executives. Scrolling through the messages, her heart sank. They were planning a major restructuring initiative, one that involved laying off hundreds of employees while simultaneously awarding themselves massive bonuses. Attached to the email was a detailed spreadsheet outlining the scheme, complete with dollar amounts and timelines. Mary's mind raced. This was it, the smoking gun she'd been searching for. With trembling hands, she copied the files onto a USB drive, careful not to leave any traces behind. As she finished, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Panicking, she slipped the drive into her pocket and grabbed her mop, feigning nonchalance as Gerald entered the room. "What are you still doing here?" he snapped, eyeing her suspiciously. "Your shift ended an hour ago." Mary shrugged, affecting a sheepish smile. "Just making sure I didn't miss anything," she replied innocently. Gerald studied her for a moment longer before turning away, muttering under his breath about lazy workers. Once he was gone, Mary exhaled sharply, her body trembling with adrenaline. Back home, she pored over the documents, piecing together the full extent of the corruption. It was worse than she'd feared, a systematic dismantling of everything she'd built, driven by greed and ego. But she also saw an opportunity. Armed with this evidence, she could hold Robert accountable, force him to confront the consequences of his actions. Whether he changed or fell depended entirely on him. As dawn broke over the city, Mary sat at her kitchen table, staring at the USB drive in front of her. Tomorrow, she would step out of the shadows and reclaim her place as the founder of Williams Innovations. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the company, but for the people who deserved better. Mary's resolve hardened as she realized that exposing corruption required more than just gathering evidence, it demanded understanding the true nature of those involved. She began devising subtle tests to gauge the morality and integrity of key players within Williams Innovations. Her first target was Gerald Hayes, the operations manager whose disdain for janitors bordered on cruelty. One evening, after cleaning his office, Mary accidentally left behind a document, a fabricated report detailing a glaring financial discrepancy in the company's maintenance budget. It wasn't real, of course, but it looked convincing enough to raise questions. If Gerald noticed it, he'd have two choices: report the issue or ignore it for personal gain. Mary knew which path he'd likely take. The next morning, she lingered near Gerald's desk under the pretense of emptying trash bins. Sure enough, she spotted the document lying untouched on his desk. His coffee cup sat beside it, its contents cold and abandoned. Clearly, he hadn't even glanced at it. Later that day, while mopping the executive wing, Mary overheard him boasting to Derek about securing a hefty bonus by cutting costs in maintenance. "Who cares if the floors are a little dirty?" he chuckled. "It's not like anyone important notices." Mary clenched her jaw, disgusted but unsurprised. Gerald had passed, or rather, failed, her test with flying colors. Next, Mary turned her attention to Derek Phillips, the arrogant marketing director who treated lower-level employees like invisible servants. One afternoon, she deliberately dropped her janitorial keys near his office door, pretending to be distracted while refilling the nearby water cooler. The metallic clatter drew Derek's attention, and he stepped out to investigate. Spotting the keys, he picked them up with an exaggerated sigh. "Janet, Isn't it? He drawled, holding the keys aloft as though they were contaminated. You really should be more careful. We can't have you losing these and causing trouble. Mary approached meekly, extending her hand. Thank you, Mr. Phillips, she said softly. But instead of handing them back, Derek smirked. Oh, don't worry, I'll make sure someone brings them to the supply closet later. You clearly can't handle responsibility. With that, he tossed the keys onto his desk and disappeared back into his office, leaving Mary standing there, humiliated yet unsurprised. Another failure, one that confirmed everything she already suspected about him. As she retrieved the keys herself during her next round of cleaning, Mary reflected on how easily Derek dismissed others' dignity. He didn't see people, he saw obstacles to his success. And unfortunately for Williams' innovations, that mindset permeated every decision he made. Her final test was less calculated and more instinctual. Late one night, while finishing her rounds, Mary feigned illness in the hallway outside the IT department. Clutching her stomach, she leaned against the wall, letting out a soft groan. Most employees hurried past without so much as a glance, too focused on their own tasks to notice. But then, Chris Taylor appeared, concern etched across his face. Janet, are you okay? He asked, rushing to her side. Without hesitation, he offered his arm to steady her. Here, let me help you sit down. Do you need water? Should I call someone? His kindness brought tears to Mary's eyes, not because she needed assistance but because his reaction stood in stark contrast to everyone else's indifference. I'm fine, really, she assured him, forcing a weak smile. Just a little dizzy. I think I worked too hard today. Chris stayed with her until she regained her composure, offering words of encouragement and even walking her to the break room to ensure she rested. When he finally left, Mary watched him go, feeling a swell of gratitude. In a sea of selfishness and greed, Chris was a beacon of hope, an example of what Williams' innovations could still become if given the chance. With her tests complete, Mary retreated to her tiny apartment, replaying each interaction in her mind. Gerald's greed, Derek's arrogance, and Chris's compassion painted a vivid picture of the company's moral landscape. These weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper rot that had taken hold under Robert's leadership. But as she sifted through the evidence she'd gathered, Mary faced a new challenge, deciding who deserved redemption and who didn't. Gerald and Derek were beyond saving, at least in her eyes. Their actions revealed a fundamental lack of empathy, a willingness to exploit others for personal gain. Chris, on the other hand, represented the kind of leader Williams' innovations desperately needed, someone who valued ethics over ambition, community over profit. Still, Mary couldn't save the company alone. She needed allies, people who shared her vision and were willing to fight for change. Chris seemed like the obvious choice, but involving him came with risks. If he got caught helping her, his career would be ruined. Yet, keeping him in the dark felt wrong. He deserved to know the truth, especially since he'd shown such unwavering support. That night, Mary drafted a plan. She would reach out to Chris discreetly, explaining her mission and asking for his help. Together, they could expose the corruption and rebuild the company from the ground up. It wouldn't be easy, the road ahead was fraught with danger, but Mary believed it was worth the risk. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to dream of a better future, one where Williams' innovations once again stood for innovation, integrity, and inclusivity. The following evening, Mary found Chris working late in the IT department. As she pushed her mop cart toward his cubicle, she hesitated, nerves fluttering in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Taking a deep breath, she approached him. Chris, can we talk for a minute? She asked quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. He looked up, surprised but welcoming. Of course, Janet. What's on your mind? Mary lowered her voice, choosing her words carefully. I've been here long enough to see things most people overlook, she began. Things aren't right at this company. People are suffering, and those in power don't care. I want to fix it, but I can't do it alone." For a moment, Chris simply stared at her, processing her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I know what you mean," he admitted. "I've seen it too, the layoffs, the favoritism, the lies. But what can we do? We're just small cogs in a big machine." Mary leaned closer, her expression fierce. "We're more than that. We're the foundation of this company. Without us, nothing works. If we stand together, we can bring the truth to light. Will you help me?" Chris hesitated, weighing the risks. Finally, he extended his hand. "Count me in," he said firmly. "But we have to be smart about this. One wrong move, and we're both finished." Mary shook his hand, relief flooding through her. For the first time since returning to Williams Innovations, she didn't feel alone. With Chris by her side, she had a fighting chance to reclaim the soul of the company she'd built, and perhaps even redeem the son who'd lost his way. As they parted ways, Mary felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. Tomorrow, they would begin dismantling the web of lies that had ensnared Williams Innovations. And when the dust settled, the world would see the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Mary's days as Janet Davis grew increasingly meaningful, not just because of the evidence she was gathering but also because of the connections she was forming. Angela and Carlos, her fellow janitors, became more than co-workers, they became friends. Over late-night shifts and shared coffee breaks, Mary learned about their struggles, their dreams, and the injustices they faced within Williams Innovations. Carlos, in particular, had a story that struck a chord with Mary. A single father raising an 8-year-old daughter named Sophia, he'd been with the company for nearly a decade. Despite his dedication and glowing performance reviews, he'd recently been passed over for a promotion in favor of a younger, less experienced candidate. "I don't understand," he confessed one evening, his voice heavy with frustration. "They promised me that position years ago. I've worked overtime, stayed late, done everything they asked. But when it came time to promote someone, they acted like I didn't exist." Mary listened intently, her heart aching for him. She wanted to tell him the truth, that this wasn't the company she'd built, that Robert's leadership had twisted its values beyond recognition. But she couldn't risk revealing her identity, not yet. Instead, she offered what little comfort she could. "You deserve better, Carlos," she said softly. "Anyone who knows you can see how hard you work. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." Angela's story was equally heartbreaking. One night, while sorting cleaning supplies in the storage closet, she opened up about a supervisor who had harassed her months earlier. "He kept making comments about my appearance, asking me out even though I said no," she explained, her voice trembling. "When I finally reported him to HR, they brushed it off. Told me I was overreacting and suggested I transfer departments instead." Tears welled in her eyes as she continued. "I have 3 kids to feed, Janet. I can't afford to lose this job, so I stayed silent. But every day feels heavier than the last." Mary clenched her fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systemic failures, proof that the company had lost sight of its humanity. Angela and Carlos deserved justice, and Mary vowed to fight for them, no matter the cost. As Mary deepened her bond with Angela and Carlos, she also found solace in Chris Taylor's friendship. Though he didn't know her true identity, Chris confided in her frequently, venting his frustrations about the unethical practices he witnessed daily. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Mary joined him in the IT department break room. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes betraying the stress he carried. "I'm starting to think I made a mistake coming here," Chris admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "This place, it's not what I thought it would be. People talk about innovation and progress, but all I see is greed and exploitation. It's like everyone's forgotten why we're here in the first place." Mary nodded sympathetically, encouraging him to continue. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. Chris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Take the recent layoffs, for example. They cut half the janitorial staff last week, claiming budget constraints. But then, the executives approved a massive bonus pool for themselves. How does that make sense? Or the way they treat lower-level employees, like we're disposable. No one bats an eye when someone quits or gets fired because they know there's always another person desperate enough to take their place." His words resonated deeply with Mary. She'd seen firsthand how toxic the culture had become, how fear silenced dissent and loyalty was rewarded with neglect. Yet, hearing Chris articulate these thoughts reminded her that she wasn't alone in her fight. There were still good people at Williams Innovations, people who cared about doing the right thing. Inspired by Chris's passion, Mary decided to involve Angela and Carlos in her mission. She knew it was risky, exposing corruption meant putting herself, and anyone who helped her, at significant risk. But she also believed that change required collective effort. Together, they could shine a light on the injustices plaguing the company and demand accountability. One night, after finishing their shifts, Mary gathered Angela and Carlos in the supply closet, where they often took breaks. "Listen," she began, lowering her voice to ensure privacy. "I know things aren't right here. You've both told me your stories, and I've seen enough to know this isn't just about bad management, it's about corruption. I want to fix it, but I can't do it alone. Will you help me?" For a moment, silence hung in the air. Angela exchanged a wary glance with Carlos before speaking. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" she asked cautiously. "We're already stretched thin as it is. If we get caught—" "I understand," Mary interrupted quickly. "And I won't ask you to do anything that puts you in danger. But if we stand together, if we share our voices, we might have a chance to make things right. For ourselves, for our families, and for everyone else being treated unfairly." Carlos hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'm tired of feeling powerless," he said firmly. "If there's a way to fight back, count me in." Angela followed suit, her resolve strengthening as she realized she wasn't alone. "Me too," she whispered. "But we'll need a plan." Mary smiled, relief washing over her. With Angela and Carlos on board, she felt a renewed sense of hope. They may have been small cogs in the machine, but together, they had the power to bring it grinding to a halt. Over the next few days, Mary worked closely with her newfound allies to devise a strategy. Angela and Carlos agreed to document instances of mistreatment, from discriminatory remarks to unsafe working conditions. Meanwhile, Chris continued sharing insider information about executive misconduct, unaware that his contributions were part of a larger plan. Each piece of evidence strengthened their case, painting a damning portrait of Williams Innovations' leadership. One evening, as they reviewed their findings in the break room, Mary reflected on how far they'd come. Just weeks ago, she'd been a lone figure navigating the shadows, unsure of whom to trust. Now, she had a team, a ragtag group of janitors and an intern united by a shared desire for justice. Their diversity of perspectives only added strength to their cause. Angela brought emotional insight, Carlos provided practical knowledge of operations, and Chris offered technical expertise. Together, they represented every level of the company, proving that change could come from anywhere. Still, challenges loomed ahead. Exposing corruption meant confronting powerful enemies, people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone standing in their way. Mary knew the risks, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. This wasn't just about reclaiming her company, it was about restoring dignity to those who'd been stripped of it. The final piece of their plan fell into place during a tense encounter with Gerald Hayes. Late one night, Mary deliberately left a stack of incriminating documents on a table near the executive lounge, knowing Gerald would stumble upon them. Sure enough, he appeared moments later, scanning the papers with growing alarm. "What is this garbage?" he muttered, glaring at Mary as she mopped nearby. Where did you find these? Mary shrugged innocently, feigning ignorance. I don't know, sir. Someone must have dropped them. Should I throw them away? Gerald snatched the documents from her hands, stuffing them into his briefcase. No, he snapped. I'll handle it. Later that week, Angela and Carlos reported seeing Gerald meeting secretly with Derek Phillips in the parking lot. Their hushed conversation ended abruptly when Derek handed Gerald an envelope, likely containing cash. Mary's suspicions were confirmed. Gerald was complicit in the corruption, willing to cover up wrongdoing for personal gain. Armed with this knowledge, Mary finalized their approach. They would compile all their evidence, emails, financial records, testimonies, and present it to the board of directors anonymously. To protect themselves, they'd use encrypted channels and burner phones, ensuring no trace led back to them. It was a risky move, but Mary believed it was worth it. As dawn broke over the city, Mary stood alongside Angela, Carlos, and Chris, each holding a copy of the dossier they'd prepared. This is it, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Tomorrow, the world will know the truth. And whether Williams' innovation survives or crumbles, we'll have done everything in our power to set it right. With that, they dispersed, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in months, Mary felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the company, but for the people who deserved better. The battle was far from over, but together, they were ready to fight. Mary's resolve hardened with each passing day, but the pressure of maintaining her disguise as Janet Davis was beginning to take its toll. She knew she needed one final test, a moment that would expose the true character of those around her once and for all. One evening, while cleaning the executive wing, she staged an accidental injury. As she pushed her mop cart down the hallway, she deliberately tripped over a loose floorboard, letting out a sharp cry as she tumbled to the ground. The noise drew attention almost immediately. Executives poured out of nearby offices, curious about the commotion. Derek Phillips was among them, his face twisted in annoyance. "What's going on here?" he snapped, glancing at Mary sprawled on the floor. Without waiting for an answer, he turned away, muttering something about clumsy janitors under his breath. Gerald Hayes appeared next, scowling as he surveyed the scene. "Get up," he barked, showing no concern for her well-being. "We don't have time for this." But then, Chris Taylor rushed over, his expression filled with genuine worry. "Janet, are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. He extended a hand to help her up, his voice soft but urgent. "Do you need me to call someone? Should I get you some ice for your ankle?" Mary hesitated, feigning pain as she allowed him to assist her. His kindness stood in stark contrast to the indifference of others, reinforcing what she already suspected: Chris was different. He cared, not because it benefited him, but because it was the right thing to do. As she limped back to the supply closet, leaning heavily on Chris's arm, Mary felt a pang of guilt. She hated deceiving him, especially when he showed such compassion. But she reminded herself that this was bigger than any one person, even someone as kind-hearted as Chris. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Later that week, Mary witnessed another injustice that left her seething with anger. A janitor named Marcus, who'd been with the company for years, was abruptly fired after refusing to cover up an executive's mistake. It started when Gerald accidentally spilled coffee on an important document during a meeting. When Marcus arrived to clean the mess, Gerald demanded he sign off on a false report claiming the document had been damaged by faulty equipment, not human error. Marcus balked at the request. "I'm not lying for you," he said firmly. "If you spilled it, own up to it." Gerald's face turned red with rage. "You ungrateful little," he began, cutting himself off before storming off. The next morning, Marcus received a termination letter citing poor performance as the reason for his dismissal. Everyone knew it was retaliation, but no one dared speak up. Mary watched silently as Marcus packed his belongings, humiliation etched across his face. Angela approached him hesitantly, offering words of comfort, but there was nothing anyone could do to ease the sting of betrayal. That night, during their shift, Angela recounted the incident to Mary, her voice trembling with outrage. "They think they can treat us like garbage," she whispered. "Like we don't matter." Mary clenched her fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just about Marcus, it was about every employee who'd been silenced, dismissed, or discarded. Williams Innovations had become a toxic environment where power trumped morality, and Mary was determined to change that. Her determination only deepened when she overheard Gerald discussing layoffs targeting janitorial and minority employees. Late one night, as she cleaned the executive lounge, she lingered near the door, pretending to scrub floors while eavesdropping on a private conversation. Inside, Gerald and Derek were seated at a table, poring over spreadsheets and memos. "We need to cut costs," Gerald announced, tapping a pen against the page. "Start with the janitors, they're expendable. And let's trim down the diversity hires too. Frankly, most of them aren't pulling their weight anyway." Derek nodded approvingly, adding, "It'll send a message. People need to understand that loyalty is earned, and it's earned by staying quiet." Mary's blood boiled. Their casual disregard for human lives made her sick. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were real people with families, dreams, and aspirations. Yet, to Gerald and Derek, they were nothing more than obstacles to profit margins. As she finished mopping and slipped away unnoticed, Mary vowed to use their own words against them. She recorded snippets of the conversation on her phone, careful to capture every damning detail. This audio evidence would be the final nail in the coffin, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that corruption ran deep within Williams Innovations. With the pieces falling into place, Mary gathered her allies, Angela, Carlos, and Chris, for a final strategy session. They met late at night in the IT server room, huddled around a laptop as Mary reviewed the evidence they'd collected. Emails detailing financial misconduct, forged contracts, discriminatory remarks, and now Gerald's candid admission about targeting vulnerable employees, all of it painted a damning picture of systemic abuse. "This is incredible work," Chris said, scrolling through the files. "But how do we make sure it gets to the right people without putting ourselves at risk?" Mary nodded thoughtfully. "We'll send it anonymously," she explained. "Using encrypted channels and burner phones. No names, no traces. Just the truth." Carlos raised a cautious hand. "What happens if they figure out it came from us? We could lose everything, our jobs, our livelihoods." Mary placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know it's risky," she admitted. "But staying silent is riskier. If we don't act now, nothing will ever change. We owe it to ourselves, and to everyone else, to try." Angela chimed in, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "She's right. We've been treated like second-class citizens for too long. It's time to fight back." Together, they finalized their plan, dividing tasks based on each person's strengths. Angela and Carlos would continue documenting mistreatment, Chris would monitor internal communications for additional evidence, and Mary would oversee the delivery of their dossier to the board of directors. The night before the big reveal, Mary found herself alone in the break room, staring at the USB drive containing their evidence. So much depended on this moment, the fate of Williams Innovations, the futures of countless employees, and perhaps even her relationship with Robert. She couldn't predict how the board would react, but she knew one thing for certain: silence was no longer an option. Her thoughts were interrupted by Chris, who entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" he asked, handing her one of the cups. Mary smiled gratefully, taking a sip as he sat down beside her. "Nervous?" he asked gently. She nodded, setting the cup aside. "Terrified, actually. But also, hopeful. For the first time in months, I feel like we might actually have a chance to fix things." Chris studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. My grandma used to say, sometimes you have to burn the forest to let new trees grow. What we're doing, it's scary. But maybe it's necessary. Mary's heart swelled with gratitude. Chris didn't know who she truly was, yet he believed in her mission enough to stand by her side. In that moment, she realized that redemption wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about rebuilding trust, fostering unity, and creating a future where everyone mattered. As dawn broke over the city, Mary joined Angela, Carlos, and Chris in the parking lot, each clutching a copy of the dossier. "This is it," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Tomorrow, the world will know the truth. And whether Williams' innovation survives or crumbles, we'll have done everything in our power to set it right." With that, they dispersed, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in months, Mary felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the company, but for the people who deserved better. The battle was far from over, but together, they were ready to fight. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than anyone expected. Early that morning, an urgent email landed in every employee's inbox: emergency company-wide meeting, mandatory attendance. Rumors swirled through the halls of Williams Innovations as employees speculated about the purpose of the meeting. Some thought it was related to upcoming layoffs, others guessed it involved a major merger or acquisition. No one, not even Robert, could have anticipated what was coming. Mary woke up before dawn, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. For months, she'd played the role of Janet Davis, navigating the shadows of her own company to uncover the truth. Now, it was time to step back into the light. She dressed carefully, pulling on the same power suit she'd worn during the early days of founding Williams Innovations, a tailored navy blue ensemble that commanded respect. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer, she felt a surge of confidence. Today wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about reclaiming her legacy. When she entered the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. Executives sat stiffly at the head table, their faces masks of confusion and unease. Lower-level employees filled the rows behind them, whispering among themselves. Then, Mary walked in, and the room fell silent. Every eye turned to her, jaws dropping as recognition sank in. Gerald's face turned pale, while Derek's smirk faded into shock. Even Robert froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. "Good morning," Mary said calmly, her voice carrying across the room. "I trust you're all wondering why I'm here today." Without waiting for a response, Mary launched into her presentation, projecting evidence onto the large screen at the front of the room. Security footage showed Gerald deliberately ignoring safety hazards and mocking janitors. Audio recordings captured Derek bragging about manipulating quarterly earnings reports for personal gain. Written documents detailed shell companies funneling money offshore, signed by none other than Robert himself. "This is not the company I built," Mary continued, her tone firm but tinged with sadness. "Williams Innovations was founded on principles of innovation, integrity, and inclusivity. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of those values. And it's my fault." Her admission stunned the audience, drawing gasps from employees and executives alike. She turned her attention to Gerald, who squirmed uncomfortably under her gaze. "Gerald Hayes, your mistreatment of employees has created a toxic work environment. You've humiliated, belittled, and exploited the very people who keep this building running. That ends now." Next, she addressed Derek, whose arrogance had always masked his insecurities. "Derek Phillips, your greed knows no bounds. You've manipulated finances, silenced dissent, and treated your colleagues like pawns in your game of ambition. You are no longer welcome here." Finally, she faced Robert, her son. His expression shifted from disbelief to shame as he realized the extent of the corruption festering under his leadership. "Robert," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly, "you were supposed to carry the torch, to protect the vision we worked so hard to create. Instead, you let greed and ego blind you. But this isn't just about you, it's about everyone who's suffered because of your choices." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Employees exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others wiped away tears. For the first time in years, they saw hope, not just for justice, but for change. With the evidence laid bare, Mary wasted no time implementing consequences. Effective immediately, she announced, Gerald Hayes and Derek Phillips are terminated. Their actions have cost this company dearly, not just financially, but morally. They will be held accountable for their misconduct. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, growing louder as employees rose to their feet. It wasn't just relief, it was vindication. Years of pent-up frustration poured out in cheers and shouts of approval. Even Angela and Carlos clapped enthusiastically, tears streaming down their faces. But Mary wasn't done yet. Turning to the board of directors, she outlined a series of reforms designed to rebuild trust and restore dignity to the workplace. We need leaders who embody the values this company was built on, she declared. Leaders like Carlos Ramirez, who's dedicated nearly a decade of service despite being denied opportunities he deserved. Leaders like Angela Thompson, who's fought tirelessly to provide for her family while facing harassment and discrimination. And leaders like Chris Taylor, whose integrity and compassion remind us why we're here in the first place. One by one, she called them forward, presenting each with a promotion. Carlos would oversee facilities management, ensuring fair treatment for janitorial staff. Angela would join HR as a diversity advocate, tasked with creating policies to prevent harassment and discrimination. Chris, meanwhile, would take on a leadership role in IT, spearheading initiatives to modernize the company's infrastructure while championing ethical practices. As the newly promoted employees took their seats, pride radiating from their expressions, Mary turned her attention back to Robert. He sat slumped in his chair, his usual bravado replaced by vulnerability. "Mom," he began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing." Mary softened slightly, though her resolve remained unshaken. "Intentions don't matter when the results are destructive," she replied gently. "You have a choice now, to learn from these mistakes or walk away entirely. If you stay, you'll do so under my guidance. We'll rebuild this company together, starting with accountability and transparency." Robert nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to fix this," he admitted. "I owe it to you, to everyone." Though forgiveness wouldn't come easily, Mary recognized the sincerity in his words. Perhaps redemption was still possible, for him and for the company. To close the meeting, Mary addressed the entire room, her voice steady and resolute. "Today marks a new chapter for Williams Innovations. A chapter defined not by greed or exploitation, but by collaboration and compassion. We will honor the contributions of every employee, regardless of title or status. We will root out corruption and hold ourselves accountable to the highest standards of ethics and integrity. And most importantly, we will remember why we're here, to innovate, to inspire, and to improve lives." Her words echoed through the room, met with thunderous applause. Employees hugged one another, celebrating the dawn of a brighter future. For Angela and Carlos, it was validation after years of struggle. For Chris, it was proof that standing up for what's right pays off. And for Mary, it was redemption, a chance to reclaim the soul of the company she'd poured her heart into. As the meeting adjourned, Mary lingered near the exit, watching as employees filed out, their spirits lifted for the first time in years. Robert approached her cautiously, extending a tentative hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Mary accepted his gesture, offering a small smile. "This is just the beginning," she reminded him. "The real work starts now." Together, they stepped out into the sunlight, ready to rebuild, not just a company, but a community. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with honesty, humility, and unity, anything was possible. In the days following the grand reveal, Williams Innovations underwent a seismic shift. The shockwaves of Mary's revelations rippled through every corner of the company, forcing executives and employees alike to confront uncomfortable truths. For Robert, the weight of his failures pressed heavily on his shoulders. He spent hours in solitude, reflecting on how he'd allowed greed and ego to blind him. Finally, one evening, he sought out Mary in her office, a modest space she'd reclaimed after years away. "Mom," he began hesitantly, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't even know where to start. I've made so many mistakes. I let you down, I let the company down, and most of all, I let the people who trusted me down." His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry, for everything." Mary studied him carefully, her expression softening. She had spent countless nights wondering if Robert could rise above his flaws, if he truly understood the gravity of what he'd done. Now, seeing the sincerity in his face, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Apologies are just the beginning, Robert," she said gently. "What matters now is what you do next. This isn't about saving face or repairing your reputation, it's about earning back trust. And that takes time." Robert nodded earnestly. "I'll do whatever it takes," he promised. "I want to make this right, for you, for the employees, for everyone who's been hurt because of my decisions." True to his word, Robert threw himself into the task of rebuilding Williams Innovations. Under Mary's guidance, he initiated a massive restructuring effort aimed at restoring integrity and fairness to the workplace. Departments were reorganized to eliminate toxic hierarchies, and new policies were implemented to ensure transparency in decision-making. Executives were required to undergo ethics training, emphasizing the importance of empathy and accountability. One of the first changes was the creation of an Employee Advocacy Council, a diverse group of representatives from every level of the company tasked with addressing grievances and proposing improvements. Angela, Carlos, and Chris played key roles in shaping its mission, advocating for initiatives like paid parental leave, mental health support, and fair promotion practices. Their efforts sent a clear message: Williams Innovations valued its people above profits. Meanwhile, Robert personally visited each department to apologize for past injustices and listen to employee concerns. At first, many were skeptical, unsure whether his humility was genuine. But over time, his consistent actions began to win them over. When he reinstated Marcus, the janitor fired unjustly, and publicly acknowledged the wrongdoing, it marked a turning point. Employees started to believe that real change was possible. As the company transformed, Mary found herself reflecting on her own journey. For months, she'd worn the disguise of Janet Davis, navigating the shadows to uncover the truth. Now, standing once again as the founder of Williams Innovations, she realized her work wasn't finished, not entirely. While Robert had taken significant steps toward redemption, the ultimate test would be whether he could sustain these changes long-term. One afternoon, as they reviewed progress reports together, Mary turned to Robert with a serious expression. "You've done well so far," she admitted. "But remember this, leadership isn't about power, it's about service. Your job isn't to rule over people, it's to lift them up, to create an environment where they can thrive. Never forget that." Robert absorbed her words, nodding slowly. "I won't," he vowed. "I'll spend the rest of my career proving that I've learned from my mistakes." Satisfied with his response, Mary made a decision. "Then it's time for me to step back," she announced. "This is your company now, Robert. Lead it with wisdom and compassion. And if you ever lose sight of why we're here, look around you, at the people who make this place what it is." Though parting ways wasn't easy, Mary knew it was necessary. Her role as founder had always been to lay the foundation. Now, it was Robert's turn to build upon it. Under Robert's renewed leadership, Williams Innovations blossomed into a beacon of ethical business practices. Employee satisfaction soared as initiatives prioritizing well-being became central to the company's mission. Flexible work hours, wellness programs, and mentorship opportunities replaced the cutthroat culture of the past. Even Gerald and Derek's departures served as cautionary tales, reminding everyone of the consequences of corruption and abuse of power. Angela, Carlos, and Chris thrived in their new roles, proving that talent and integrity deserved recognition. Angela spearheaded diversity workshops, creating safe spaces for marginalized voices to be heard. Carlos implemented innovative cleaning protocols that not only improved efficiency but also reduced environmental impact. And Chris led tech-driven projects that streamlined operations while fostering collaboration across departments. The ripple effects extended beyond the company itself. Industry leaders took notice of Williams Innovation's transformation, praising its commitment to social responsibility. Media outlets highlighted the story as proof that even the darkest chapters could lead to redemption, if handled with honesty and courage. For Mary, watching the company flourish brought a deep sense of fulfillment. Though she no longer held an official title, her influence remained undeniable. Employees often approached her during visits, thanking her for fighting for them when no one else would. Each interaction reinforced her belief that true success wasn't measured by profits or accolades, it was measured by lives touched and communities strengthened. Months later, Mary stood on the rooftop garden of Williams Innovation's headquarters, overlooking the bustling city below. It was a crisp autumn evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Behind her, Robert joined her silently, offering a warm smile as he handed her a cup of tea. "Do you think we've done enough?" he asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Mary sipped her tea thoughtfully before answering. "No company is perfect," she replied. "But perfection isn't the goal. Progress is. As long as we keep striving to do better, for our employees, for our communities, for the world, we'll never stop moving forward." Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I couldn't have done this without you," he admitted. "You saved us, all of us." Mary placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You saved yourselves," she corrected gently. "By choosing to change, to grow, to care. That's what makes a leader, not titles or authority, but the willingness to put others first." As they stood side by side, mother and son, the future of Williams Innovation stretched out before them, a tapestry woven with resilience, redemption, and hope. Together, they had proven that even the most broken systems could be rebuilt, one courageous choice at a time. 1 year had passed since the dramatic overhaul of Williams Innovations, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Gone were the days of toxic hierarchies and unchecked greed. In their place stood a company defined by collaboration, integrity, and purpose. Under Robert's renewed leadership, and with guidance from Mary, the business not only survived but thrived. Revenue soared as clients and partners recognized the value of working with an organization committed to ethical practices. But more importantly, employees flourished in ways they never thought possible. Chris Taylor, once a humble intern, now held a senior executive position overseeing workplace culture initiatives. His innovative programs focused on fostering inclusivity, transparency, and mutual respect. One of his proudest achievements was the introduction of Leadership Immersion Week, a mandatory program for all executives. Before assuming leadership roles, candidates were required to spend 1 week performing lower-tier jobs, whether it was cleaning floors, answering phones, or troubleshooting IT issues. The goal was simple yet profound: to remind leaders of the challenges faced by frontline workers and ensure decisions were made with empathy. "It's changed everything," Chris explained during a company-wide town hall meeting. "When you've spent hours mopping floors or fielding customer complaints, you start seeing things differently. You realize that every role matters, that success isn't just about numbers, it's about people." Employees applauded enthusiastically, their trust in leadership stronger than ever. Angela and Carlos, meanwhile, had risen to stable positions that reflected their hard work and dedication. Angela now led the Diversity and Inclusion Department, implementing policies that protected marginalized voices and celebrated cultural differences. Carlos oversaw facilities management, ensuring safe and efficient operations while mentoring new hires. Together, they symbolized the heart of Williams Innovations, a workforce united by shared values and mutual respect. For Mary, watching these changes unfold brought immeasurable joy. She often visited the office, though less frequently than before, stepping into a role she jokingly referred to as chief cheerleader. Employees greeted her warmly, sharing stories of how the company's new culture had improved their lives. Marcus, the janitor reinstated after being wrongfully fired, approached her one afternoon with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I'd still have a job, or hope, if it weren't for you." Mary smiled, patting his shoulder affectionately. "You earned this, Marcus. All of you did. This company wouldn't be where it is today without your resilience and determination." Though proud of what they'd accomplished, Mary knew it was time to step away completely. At 72, she felt ready to embrace retirement, not out of obligation, but out of peace of mind. For years, she'd carried the weight of Williams Innovations on her shoulders, fearing its collapse under poor leadership. Now, seeing Robert and his team steer the company toward brighter horizons, she finally allowed herself to let go. One evening, as she sat in her garden sipping tea, Robert joined her, pulling up a chair beside her. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking. Are you sure you're ready to retire? We could still use your wisdom." Mary chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart, my work here is done. It's your turn to carry the torch, and you're doing brilliantly. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "I've got gardens to tend, books to read, and grandchildren to spoil." Robert laughed, relief washing over him. "Well, if you change your mind, you'll always have a seat at the table." "I know," Mary replied warmly. "And knowing that makes walking away so much easier." As part of her farewell celebration, the company hosted a special event honoring Mary's legacy. Employees gathered in the newly renovated atrium, a space designed to reflect the company's core values of innovation, integrity, and inclusivity. Photos of Mary throughout the years lined the walls, capturing moments from her early days as founder to her undercover stint as Janet Davis. A plaque commemorating her contributions read, "To Mary Williams, a visionary leader who taught us that true success is measured by lives touched and communities strengthened." During the ceremony, Angela and Carlos delivered heartfelt speeches, thanking Mary for believing in them when no one else did. "She didn't just fight for us," Angela said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "She reminded us that we matter, that our voices deserve to be heard." Carlos followed, adding, "Ms. Williams showed us that even the smallest cog can stop the machine if it stops turning. Because of her, we're not just employees, we're a family." When it was Chris's turn to speak, he shared a story about how Mary's courage inspired him to stand up for what's right. "She taught me that leadership isn't about titles, it's about action," he said. "And because of her, I'll never forget that." Finally, Robert took the stage, his gratitude evident in every word. "My mother built this company with grit, passion, and an unwavering belief in the power of people. Today, we honor her not just as our founder, but as our guiding light. Thank you, Mom, for everything." The room erupted in applause, tears streaming down faces as Mary rose to accept a standing ovation. Though typically reserved, she couldn't help but beam with pride. This wasn't just her legacy, it was theirs. In the weeks following her official retirement, Mary settled into a quieter life, though her influence continued to ripple through Williams Innovations. Stories of her bravery spread far beyond the company, inspiring other organizations to adopt similar reforms. Leadership Immersion Week became a model for ethical training nationwide, earning accolades from industry leaders and media outlets alike. Meanwhile, Angela and Carlos found stability and fulfillment in their roles. Angela's advocacy efforts led to partnerships with local nonprofits, creating opportunities for underserved communities. Carlos, meanwhile, spearheaded sustainability initiatives, reducing the company's carbon footprint while improving efficiency. Their contributions prove that talent, when nurtured, could transform not just a company but an entire industry. Chris, now a cornerstone of Williams Innovation's leadership team, remains steadfast in his mission to prioritize employee well-being. His initiatives included flexible work arrangements, mental health resources, and mentorship programs aimed at nurturing future leaders. "We're building a culture where everyone feels valued," he explained during a podcast interview. "Because when people thrive, so does the company." As for Robert, he embraced his role as CEO with humility and purpose. Regular check-ins with employees, transparent communication, and accountability measures ensured that the toxic practices of the past stayed buried. Each decision reinforced his commitment to serving others, not ruling over them. On a crisp spring morning, Mary stood on the porch of her countryside home, sipping coffee as the sun rose over rolling hills. Behind her, laughter echoed from inside, the sound of her grandchildren playing with toys scattered across the living room floor. For the first time in decades, she felt truly at peace. The burden of responsibility no longer weighed on her shoulders. Instead, she carried memories of triumph, resilience, and unity. Later that day, Robert called, updating her on the latest developments. "We hit record profits last quarter," he announced proudly. "But more importantly, employee satisfaction scores are higher than ever. People are happy, Mom. Really happy." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's all I ever wanted, for everyone to feel like they belong. Keep nurturing that spirit, Robert. It's the foundation of everything." As they ended the call, Mary returned to her garden, tending to blooming flowers and budding plants. Each blossom reminded her of the seeds she'd planted at Williams Innovations, seeds of hope, integrity, and compassion. Though retired, she knew her legacy would continue to grow, nurtured by those who shared her vision. Williams Innovations wasn't just a company anymore, it was a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring strength of humanity. And as Mary watched the horizon stretch endlessly before her, she realized something profound. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't measured by what we achieve, but by the lives we touch along the way. The takeaway: lessons from a story of courage and redemption. At its core, the story of Williams Innovations is more than just a tale of corporate corruption. It's a powerful reminder of the importance of integrity, accountability, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Mary Williams taught us that leadership isn't about titles or authority, it's about service. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person and ensuring that no one is left behind. Her journey shows us that even in the darkest moments, change is possible when we choose to act with honesty and humility. We also learned that redemption is within reach for anyone willing to confront their mistakes. Robert's transformation reminds us that failure isn't final, it's an opportunity to grow, to listen, and to lead with purpose. And through characters like Angela, Carlos, and Chris, we see the profound impact of lifting others up. Their resilience proves that when people are valued, they can achieve extraordinary things. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: silence in the face of injustice only perpetuates harm. Whether you're a CEO, an intern, or a janitor, your voice matters. Every action you take, or don't take, shapes the world around you. So ask yourself, what kind of leader do you want to be? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. We're committed to bringing you compelling narratives that inspire, challenge, and empower. By following us, you'll never miss an update on stories like this one, stories that remind us of the power of courage, compassion, and change. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Together, let's keep building a better future, one story at a time.